It's Tuesday, August 15th, 2023. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Documenting Congress Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here today in Bethesda, Maryland with Dr. Donald A. Ritchie. A native of New York City, Ritchie earned his bachelor's degree from the City College of New York and his master's and PhD in history from the University of Maryland, College Park. He joined the Senate Historical Office as Associate Historian in 1976. It was in that role that he created and oversaw the U.S. Senate Oral History Program. In 2009, Don became Senate Historian, a position he held until his retirement in 2015. He's the author of numerous books, including Press Gallery, Congress and the Washington Correspondence, Electing FDR, the New Deal Campaign of 1932, and The Columnist, Leaks, Lies, and Libel in Drew Pearson's Washington, as well as the widely read and influential Doing Oral History, A Practical Guide. He has also edited the Oxford Handbook of Oral History. He has served in leading roles with the American Historical Association, International Oral History Association, and Society for History in the Federal Government, as well as terms as president of the Oral History Association. Dr. Ritchie, Don, thank you so much for bearing with me for that introduction of your long and illustrious career in and around Congress, especially the U.S. Senate. Mm-hmm. And thank you for inviting me to your home here in Bethesda. It's always good to get out. I guess we're technically inside the Beltway.
No, we're just outside.
Just outside the Beltway.
That's why you can think clearly.
That's right. That's right. And you can hear birds and see the sunshine. Well, let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your childhood and upbringing. You grew up in New York City.
Yes, in Elmhurst, Queens.
Okay.
Right in the middle of Queens. My great-grandfather had come over from Germany as a farmer and had actually farmed the land where I grew up, which was very urban when I grew up mm-hmm. there. Unfortunately, he rented the land rather than owned the land, but that's what our roots were firmly planted in Queens. But from Queens, you could see the skyline of Manhattan.
Right.
And to me, that was always Oz. And so I drifted in that direction, and I went to local schools and to Newtown High School, the same high school my grandfather and my parents had gone to. And then many of my friends went to Queens College, but I wanted to go into Manhattan. And I got into the City College of New York, which in those days was absolutely free, so that was a real asset. But the penalty of it being free was it was also very strict. You had to keep your grades up, and you really had to work hard to stay in. In fact, they tended to fail quite a large percentage of the freshman class, and I never realized until I left the City College of New York that not everybody else had to work quite as hard for their education. But I got a wonderful undergraduate education at the City College, and I was very fortunate that I managed to take several classes with a professor named Fred Israel. And Fred taught American history, American political history, and he also had a historical seminar. And in that seminar, I did my first oral history interviews. I learned how to use archives. I learned how to do the kind of research that historians was expected to, including, I vividly remember that we were assigned to read a week of the New York Times on microfilms, my first experience using microfilm. And I made all sorts of notes. It was in 1933, and so I made lots of notes about what FDR was doing and this and that. And came back into class, and Fred's first question was, what happened to the little boy who was swept into the storm sewer? Well, of course, that was a small story, although it did make page 1 at one point. And nobody in the class knew the outcome of what happened to him. Fortunately, he was rescued in the East River. But Fred was saying, don't just look at the headlines. You have to read the other articles. You have to get a flavor of the time. And he was just a wonderful professor who really shaped my career, my early career, even to the point that when I got ready to graduate, I was thinking about going to graduate school. In fact, I was determined to go to graduate school. That was because the Vietnam War was going on. And if I left school, I'd be draft eligible. And so my plan was to get a master's degree and then to teach high school in New York City. And I was, education was my minor field, and I was a student teacher at Charles Evans Hughes High School in Manhattan. And I thought, well, that's how I'm going to plan my career. And I told Fred about this. I said, I could go to Columbia, I could go to NYU. And Fred said, I went to Columbia, he said, and I spent my entire graduate career on the train going to Washington to work at the Library of Congress. He said, if I had life to do all over again, I'd go to a graduate school somewhere near the Library of Congress. And he said, I happen to know I have good friends who teach at the University of Maryland, and I'll put in a good word for you. And I applied to quite a few graduate schools, both in New York and outside the city. And the one that offered me money was the University of Maryland. They offered me a position as a teaching assistant. In those days, the University of Maryland required all undergraduates to take 2 years of history, one in American history and one in world history. And consequently, they had 120 teaching assistants in the history department because the faculty were teaching very large lecture hall assignments of 300 students or more, and they would each have 3 teaching assistants for each class. So I was very happy to be hired, and I got down there. And then it turned out that Fred Israel was working on a project with Arthur Schlesinger, and they were doing a book on running for president, and they had a lineup of the most famous political historians of the day writing on each presidential election. And then they were going to include documents. And so they needed somebody at the Library of Congress to run through the stacks collecting the documents that they would include in this volume. And they hired me to do that. So I spent a good part of my first 2 years at the University of Maryland as a stack rat, really, in the Library of Congress. And some of these historians knew exactly what they wanted. They wanted an editorial that appeared in the National Intelligence or on this particular date. Others just said, I need a pro-tariff editorial and an anti-tariff editorial. And so I had to be creative as to what I did. On Saturdays, I would come back with a big stack of documents and I'd stand at the Xerox machine Xeroxing. And the volumes came out, and the documents that I collected were in there. So it was a good experience for me to learn how to use the library. Thank goodness the stacks were open in those days, and I could get in there and browse.
A little different now.
And I learned how to do work for my own master's thesis, and I did a lot of work in the manuscript room at the Library of Congress, which was also a wonderful experience because there were faculty and there were graduate students, and there were lots of people who would come to help you when you were trying to figure out how to maneuver through. I was using the records of Theodore Roosevelt. My master's thesis was on why the Progressive Party, which had come in second in 1912, went out of business by 1916. Why couldn't the third party sustain itself? So I started by looking at Theodore Roosevelt's papers for the month of August in 1912. And I remember the archivist came out with a cart that was completely filled with boxes. There must have been 20 boxes on it. And she said, I can bring you this much now, and I'll get you the rest when you're ready. And that was August of 1912.
Well, that was the convention,
right.
So,
And that was Theodore Roosevelt, who wrote constantly and dictated letters. And so I really got started that way, and it was a really good experience. I discovered again that City College had well prepared me for graduate school. I took a reading class in my first year, and the professor gave me his reading list and said, this is a long list, and I expect everybody to read everything that's on here.
Right.
And I looked at it, and I realized I'd read every book already on the list.
You were that grad student.
Yes. In some cases, I'd only read chapters like the introduction and the conclusion.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But I had opened every single one of those books before we got started. And I said, I think I can handle this.
Do you remember the professor?
Yes, it was Keith Olson, who became a very good friend, and was a 20th century historian, and actually offered the very first class in history since 1945 at the University of Maryland, and made me his teaching assistant in that class. And that was 1968. We were teaching modern American history. And of course, the students were coming in every day with the headlines: assassinations, riots, turmoil, the war. And they would say, "What does all this mean?" And I would say, "I don't really know, but we're going to talk about Harry Truman today, you know." And today, by the way, that the University of Maryland is still offering history since 1945. They have not updated it, but the 1968 is now the midterm in that class. So that was another good experience for me. One of the things that did go wrong, however, at that period was that the federal government, in its wisdom, decided to drop graduate school as a deferment for the military.
Yep.
And everybody in the department, it was all men, except for maybe I think there might have been 2 women. There was real prejudice against giving teaching assistants or any kind of money to women,
right,
because the feeling was that, well, they were just going to get married and not pursue a career. There was one African-American man and one African-American woman, and maybe 2 other women in the department among the teaching assistants. We talked about the draft constantly. And sure enough, a bunch of us got called to go up to Fort Holabird in Baltimore to do a physical. And I was 1A, but somehow I just never thought that they were ever going to call me. You know, I had thick glasses, and I was graduate school, and I wasn't very physically fit, and so I wasn't worried. Well, it turned out that out of 120 teaching assistants, 2 of us got drafted. The one African-American man, he went into the Army, and me, I got drafted into the U.S. Marine Corps, much to my surprise. It turned out that the Marines in any branch of the service can use the draft if they need it. And in 1968, the Marine Corps desperately needed it. And so I wound up on the train going to Parris Island, and I looked at the others. There were 6 of us or 7 of us who had gotten drafted into the Marine Corps. We were all either overweight or underweight. We were all wearing glasses. None of us looked like John Wayne. And I did a little poll, and it turned out we were all either college graduates or had some college experience. And so I realized that the Marine Corps was using the draft to get a better educated group, and they were probably going to give us desk jobs. So I thought, if I can get through boot camp, I think I'll be okay.
No mean feat at Parris Island.
Yes, but I managed to turn a 6-week boot camp experience into a 6-month experience, because I broke a few bones in the process. And they sent me to the hospital, and I finally recuperated, and they sent me back. And we all had to pass a big physical fitness test. And anybody who flunked it would get a medical discharge. And I flunked it along with about 30 other guys. And so I was the admin body, so I stood outside the colonel's office with a sheet and checked off the names as each one went in. And they would in, and the colonel would yell at them and then discharge them, and they would come dancing out and get on the bus to leave. And I was the last one to go in. And the colonel said, "Ritchie, you flunked this blank, blank, blank test like all those other blank, blank, blank losers out there. But the drill instructors tell me you're highly motivated, so I'm going to give you one more chance." So I went outside, and there's this busload of guys who are waving goodbye, driving out, and I walked back into Parris Island. I just determined one way or the other I was going to get out of there, and so I did finish Parris Island. I was in very good physical shape by the time I left.
Yeah, I bet.
But even that had a silver lining to it, because during the period that I was in Parris Island, during those 6 months, Nixon came up with Vietnamization. And the first thing they did was take out non-combatant troops. So in other words, they left the combat troops there. They took out as many of the supply clerks and the others who were not in combat situations. And they were no longer sending supply clerks to Vietnam. Instead, they sent me to Hawaii, to Pearl Harbor, where we handled goods that were being shipped to Vietnam or being shipped back. And I can tell you that Pearl Harbor was a much nicer place to be than anywhere in Vietnam in 1960, 69, 70, 71, when I was there. So then at the end of that, I had to decide, was I going to go back to graduate school? And I very much decided I missed it a lot, especially when September came around. I actually took classes at the University of Hawaii at night.
Oh, okay.
I took a class in Russian history. It was my minor field. And I took a class in computer sciences to see if there's a future in that. And also, in those days, the Marine Corps used to require that you clean the barracks on Thursday nights. That was field day, they called it. And you really scrubbed the place clean. It was being an inspection the next day. The only excuse for not doing field day was to be taking classes. So I went to the university and I said, "What are you offering on Thursday
On
nights?"
Thursday.
And so that was how my schedule worked out that way. So I thought, well, you know, that I could go anywhere. I could apply, and my grades were good. I got good recommendations. And so I was thinking seriously of going to the University of Chicago and working with Richard Wade, because urban history had been one of my passions. So my very first article was about politics in New York, politics and unemployment in New York in 1914. And then I thought, you know, if I do that, I have to start from scratch. They have to figure out who I am. If I go back to the University of Maryland, I'm famous there. I'm the one poor soul who got drafted into the Marine Corps. And the faculty know me, the graduate students know me. And in the interim, I'd been getting letters from friends of mine saying, the job market is disappearing. It's like someone pulled the plug. In the 60s, the job market was abundant, and people were being hired at conventions, ABD, all but dissertation. You know, there were lots of jobs. But starting around 1970, 71, 72, while I'm in the Marine Corps, the situation is changing very drastically. And I thought, I need to get my PhD as quick as possible. And so it would be better if I went back to a place where I was well established, I knew the ropes, and I could finish as soon as I could. And so Maryland took me back, and I was famous. A lot of people, I've been writing to my graduate advisor, and he'd been reading my letters aloud to his seminars while I was gone along the way. So everybody wanted to know about my career in the Marine Corps. And my old friends, of course, thought I was the least likely Marine that they'd ever met, so they wanted to hear how those stories worked out as well. So I settled back in, and I decided that the mistake that a lot of other graduate students seem to have made was they didn't pick a dissertation subject until after they'd finished their comprehensive exams. I thought, I am going to start as soon as I get into this program, and I'm going to be working on the side on my dissertation. And I got back in. I had one subject in mind. I went to the National Archives, and a very astute archivist informed me that most of those records had been destroyed in a flood in the 1920s, and that what I was trying to do would be very hard to prove. And so I decided I've got to go the path of least resistance. And there was an archivist named Carolyn Sung, S-U-N-G, who had been in one of my seminars, in that reading class at Maryland, when I was working on my master's degree. And every day she would come to class and say, I'm processing the most interesting collection, the most interesting man. He's just fascinating. She would go on and on. I sort of stored it in the back of my mind, and I ran into Carolyn at the Library of Congress, and I said, Carolyn, whatever happened to that collection? And she said, well, it's processed, and it's open, and nobody's used it. So I went down to look at the papers of James M. Landis, who had been he'd been dean of the Harvard Law School. He'd also been the person who set up the Securities Exchange Act Commission, Securities SEC Commission. He'd been chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board. He'd worked for Roosevelt. He'd worked for Truman. He worked for Kennedy. And I thought, this could be a good dissertation on federal regulation. Plus, he had a secretary who typed his letters for him. He had 200 boxes of typed letters. And I had worked earlier in the progressive era when people were still handwriting, and I thought I'm going to go to the typewritten era. So I started doing this, and with the first day I worked on it, I realized there was a dissertation there, and so I filed right away for a dissertation. Good thing I did, because there was another very prominent historian, Joel Seligman, who later on told me that he was getting ready to file to do a dissertation on James Landis, but I beat him to the punch. And so he worked on something else. He never quite forgave me for that. one day it was a Saturday, I was in the Library of Congress pulling things out of Landis's papers, and I pulled out 50 pages of a transcript of an interview that he had done. And it was marked page 650 to 700. And I knew it was very shortly before he died, because he made a reference to John Kennedy's assassination. And he died maybe 6 or 7 months after that. So I went to the desk and I said, I've got these 50 pages. Where are the first 650 pages? And they said, we don't know. You know, he died, and they shuffled all of his papers together, and this is what he had. He didn't have anything else. So I came back to the University of Maryland, and Martha Ross was teaching a class in oral history, which I foolishly never took. And I said to her, Martha, this is clearly an oral history. Do you have any idea where I could go to find the rest of it? She said, well, it looks like something that Columbia University would have done. So I contacted Columbia, and they said, yes, indeed, we have all 700 pages, but it's closed until 1975, and this was 1972. Well, fortunately, the executor of the estate was Landis's son-in-law, who was a professor of history at American University. So I went to see Charles McLaughlin, and I sort of threw myself on his mercy. And I promised him that I would never publish anything before 1975, and he knew that it was very unlikely that I would. So he gave me permission, and I went to New York to look at this collection. I was not able to photocopy any of it, because Columbia is under contract with the Microfilm Corporation, was about to microfilm this. So I had a stack of 3x5 cards and a pencil, and 700 pages of an interview. And there was my subject telling me his life in the first person, going back to his childhood in a missionary compound in Japan, working through everything, all sorts of experiences, talking about Franklin Roosevelt, talking about writing the legislation, talking about Harry Truman firing him at some point. Just astonishing. It changed my dissertation completely from really a public focus to a public-private focus, because I was looking at him as an individual and how it shaped what he was doing as a public man. Landis, at the end of his life, got into a lot of trouble and went to jail for not paying his income taxes, which was a great embarrassment for a dean of the Harvard Law School. And so, but not one word of the oral history was about that. He never mentioned either of his wives or the messy divorce that forced him to leave Harvard. He didn't mention any of the downturns in his life. He was recounting his glory days.
Sure.
At a time he'd gotten out of jail, he was trying to say that my life was important. Don't look at my failures, look at my successes.
Right, understand.
Well, that was fine, except I was writing this dissertation, and I needed to know it all. And so I went out and I found his widow and his daughters, and I found his law partners. I found one of his old law professors who was in his 90s. I found the attorney who had prosecuted him on his income tax case, and I found his psychiatrist, who said that Landis pled guilty in this case, and so therefore they didn't call any witnesses. He said it was a miscarriage of justice. He said, I will tell you what I would have said in court if the family will permit. And of course the family was curious as to what he would have said in court. And it became quite clear that it was a psychological failure, not an attempt to cheat or to steal. If you're going to do that, you'd file faulty papers. You wouldn't not file at all. And not filing was almost an invitation to be caught. And Landis had a lot of psychological issues that were coming to a head at that stage. So I had all these interviews, and the dissertation was pretty straightforward about his government career. But then I started working on a book, and I eventually sent it out to a lot of commercial publishers. This was in the late 1970s. The worst letter I got back was from W.W. Norton, which started off, a few years ago we would undoubtedly have published this book, but there's no more market for political history, and especially not for somebody nobody's ever heard of. If you're writing a book about Harry Truman, we'd publish it, but we can't publish a book about James Landis. So then at that point I sent it to Harvard University, because he'd been a Harvard dean. and I had an editor there who was ecstatic about it and signed the book right away. And then he left. And I had a new editor coming in who really sort of felt like it was an obligation for her to publish this book. And so I always got letters from her, "Dear Dr. Ritchie," and they were, they wouldn't allow me. I had a lot of photographs that I'd collected. She said all lawyers look alike. And so there was going to be one picture on the cover. I said, the covers are disposed of. Can we have a front piece? All right, have front piece. It was very begrudging.
Mm-hmm.
And then the book came out. It was called James M. Landis, Dean of the Regulators. And one Saturday morning, my phone began to ring. And people were calling me saying, "Do you get the New Yorker?" And I said, "No, I don't subscribe to the New Yorker." And they said, "Your book is reviewed in the New Yorker." So I thought, oh, okay. I drove around town. A lot of places didn't have the New Yorker. They would get it on Monday. This was a Saturday. Finally, I found some place that had it. And there was a short review, but a really good review by an anonymous reviewer, praising both the personal side of the book and the political side of the book. And so the personal side really came from those oral histories, those interviews. I later on discovered that the New Yorker had a long-time book reviewer who had graduated from Princeton in 1921. And James Landis was the valedictorian of the class of 1921. And I think he probably always wondered why his valedictorian went to jail. And my book answered that for him. And so I got this lovely review. And then immediately Harvard Press wrote, "Dear Don."
Don, is
Dear
it?
Don, would you be interested in writing another book? Here's a contract for you. Just fill it in. And so my second book then was Press Gallery, Congress, and the Washington Correspondence, which I basically said I didn't want to write another biography. I wanted to write about a lot of people over a long period of time doing a lot of different things. I didn't want to be confined the way you are when you're writing a biography. And I went back to picked a 19th century subject, which wasn't going to allow for much oral history at that point. So, but that was the way things developed. One other part that comes out of this oral history connection is that in 1975 I got my PhD.
Right.
It was a horrible year for PhDs. There were practically no teaching jobs. We had all been trained to be teachers. Although the University of Maryland had a very good chairman of the department, Walter Rundell, who understood public history and encouraged graduate students at Maryland to look into public history because we were right next to the federal government, and the federal government was hiring, especially as the national
very forward
bicentennial
thinking
came up. It was
him,
brilliant, and he kept saying it's not a secondary position. These are important positions in their own right, and you should aspire to these positions. He was absolutely correct about that. And anyway, 1976, 75 came around. I applied to every possible job that was being advertised and got turned down by every one of them. In fact, at the American Historical Association meeting in Chicago that year, I roomed with 5 or 6 people. We were crowded into a room with lots of cots and all the rest of it. And we used to come back at night and talk about who was treated the worst at their interviews. It was clearly that these departments were just going through the motions. They had so many applicants, and they were taking so few people.
Yeah.
And so that year, I was working temporarily on a short-term project at the American Historical Association, also thanks to Walter Rundell. And one of the nice things was that they published Perspectives, the newsletter, and that's had the job listings in it. And the AHA got the job listings first before they published it. So, of course, I went down to go through all the job listings before it was published. And the Senate Historical Office was created in '75. And I remember going to one of my senior colleagues and saying, "Do you think I should apply?" And he said, "Oh, no." He said, "They're clearly looking for somebody senior and established. They're not looking for somebody who's just getting started." And I thought, well, I'm not going to say no to myself. So I sent in my application with a really glowing letter from Fred Israel at Maryland and at City College, and from Walter Rundell and others at Maryland. But the job required that you know the Washington, D.C. repositories, the Library of Congress, the National Archives. Well, I'd lived in those institutions for several years. It required that you be a political historian. That was my field. It required that you knew something about editing, and I had taken an editing seminar at the University of Maryland because we had several big editorial projects there. And then it required that you knew something about oral history, and I had done all these interviews. So if I had just created a job for myself that fit all my qualifications, I couldn't have picked anything better. And I applied in November of 1975, and so did 350 other people.
Oh.
And it took them until the spring of '76 to sort through all these applications. So eventually I was one of the 3 people called in for an interview. At the same time, I was at the American Historical Association, and the deputy director had taken a year's maternity leave. And so the director offered me her position for 1 year. And I needed to tell him by noon on Wednesday. And at 11 o'clock on Wednesday, Dick Baker called me and offered me the job at the Senate. And I went upstairs to see Mac Thompson, who was director of the AHA, and I said, I really appreciate this offer, and I would have taken it, but it is a 1-year job, and I've been offered a permanent position with the Senate. And he said he understood, and I left. And how differently things would have turned out if Dick had called at 1 o'clock in the afternoon rather than at 11. But I went to work then for the Senate in March of 1976, March 8th of 1976, and it was the beginning of a terrific career. I loved being at the Senate. I'd studied political history, and now I was surrounded by political history. I walked down the halls, and there was Hubert Humphrey, and there was Mike Mansfield, and there was a 32-year-old Joe Biden, and an astonishing group of people whose pictures I'd seen in the newspapers, who'd been on the news programs that I'd watched. It couldn't have been a better place to work. And they asked me to set up an oral history program. So I started interviewing people in 1976. We just decided we can't interview everybody, but we could do a cross sample. And we're not going to interview senators who are going to be interviewed by universities that are going to get their papers. We're not going to compete with those universities. We'll interview people who aren't being interviewed by other institutions. And so we started with some of the top staff people. First person I interviewed came to work for the Senate in 1933, and went with Key Pittman to the London Economic Conference in 1933. It was astonishing. And the next person I interviewed was a reporter of debate who had been there for 40 years, and it talked about, how do you turn senators' ramblings into the text that goes into the congressional record. And then we started just interviewing people who were retiring or available or recommended to us. Occasionally we interviewed a senator. I think the first senator I interviewed was George Smathers of Florida, who came bursting into the office one day because Claude Pepper had died. And Smathers and Pepper had run against each other in a famous primary in 1950. And Smathers said, every newspaper obituary has got that race wrong, and I'm going to set the record straight. So there's no better time to interview somebody than when they want to be interviewed. And it was a great interview. Smathers was a remarkable man. He was very close friends to John F. Kennedy. They'd shared, they were next door office mates when they came to the House of Representatives. Kennedy was so weak in those days that he would have to lean on Smathers to walk over to the chamber to vote, and they got to be very close friends. And then Smathers became very close friends to Lyndon Johnson. And then he introduced Bebe Rebozo to Richard Nixon. And so he became very close to them along the way. So he was on the inside of a very long, very important part of American political history. And it was and he was very candid with me about things. I had to prod him a little bit, particularly about race and how it played into politics. And he kept telling me it really wasn't an issue in his campaigns, and that he was always very liberal about racial issues. And finally, after I came back to it about the third time, he said, "Doctor, do you know what my state was like back in 1950? Let's face facts and what the reality was." And so, but for the most part, he was a very cooperative interviewee. I interviewed a woman who had been Joe McCarthy's chief clerk, who told me that Joe McCarthy was the only senator who ever gave her a Christmas present, a big wheel of Wisconsin cheese. And he called her by her first name, and he was a nice man. I thought, this is not the Joe McCarthy I've been reading about all this time. But she said, you know, when they turned the TV cameras on, he sort of went berserk. And so I realized at that point that there were multiple sides to Joe McCarthy.
Right.
And then years later, I wound up editing McCarthy's closed hearings.
Right.
And those interviews I did with Ruth Watt were really very useful in trying to explain McCarthy and how he operated. So oral history got me my job, and it got me the best parts of what I was doing. You know, I really learned the most about the Senate by talking to people who were there, places where I wasn't, and who could explain things to me. And I read the Congressional Record, I read the Washington Post, and they would say, oh no, that wasn't the way it was. And they would explain the background situation. I'll give you one good example of this.
Yeah.
A fellow named Stuart McClure was the chief clerk of the Education Committee on the Senate. And he talked about the National Defense Education Act, which sent a large part of my generation to college, underwrote them. He said, you know, for years the Senate had been passing an education bill. The House would not pass it. And then Sputnik went up and scared everybody. And they said, you know, it was Stuart McClure who said to his chairman, Lister Hill, if we call our education bill a defense education bill, we could probably get it past the House. And he had the memo for that, and the chairman saying, great idea on the top of it. And then it went to the House. Now, there was a congressman named Carl Ellett from Alabama who chaired the House Education Subcommittee. And he realized that the House had defeated this bill 3 times. So the Senate had to give the House something to win on to get it through. So they cooked up a scheme of grants versus loans. And the Senate basically said this should be a grant. We just give you the money. And the House said, no, these have to be loans. The people have to pay it back. The entire fight in the House was over grants versus loans. And the House won on that issue. So my question to Stuart McClure was, well, if the Senate had created this, why did you lose on such a major issue? And he put his head back and laughed. And he said, that was just a ploy. He said, Carl Elliott's cooked up that grants versus loans to give the House something to win on. He said, and you know, he said, most of those students didn't bother paying the money back anyhow. So I learned that there's a lot going on beneath the surface in Washington. And that's one of the great things that oral history can do, is take you behind the printed page and behind the memorandums and all the rest to explain what people really were doing at that time.
Well, and especially your project, you know, you talked about how you would interview folks like George Smathers from time to time, but what you were able to do was do a deep dive into all the nameless, faceless, I don't want to use the term functionaries, but the people who make the Congress and the Senate work.
Right. Oh, one was Christine McCreary, who was an African-American on Stuart Symington's staff in 1953, and she integrated the Senate cafeteria. Because Senator Symington told her, go down there and eat in the cafeteria. And she did. There was no rule against it. There was just a norm that blacks worked in the cafeteria, but they didn't eat in the cafeteria. And so she went in and she described that. Now, I never found a document that mentioned it. But her account is a very convincing account of, and basically she said, I just kept going back, and she said pretty soon they got used to me. And then after a while there were other African-American staff who came and joined her. But segregation in Washington was always sort of off the record, it was off the books. It wasn't a firm law for the most part.
De facto, yes, not de jure. Yeah.
And so, and especially at the Capitol Hill, where the Library of Congress cafeteria was segregated and the Supreme Court wasn't segregated. And the U.S. Capitol was segregated and Union Station wasn't. And people sort of learned where they could go and you know, what could happen. So these interviews were really helpful to me, and I interviewed people across the spectrum from the far right to the far left for 40 years, and not one of them ever said to me, well, where do you stand? And I think it's because I'd done a lot of research, I asked pertinent questions, right. And then I shut up and I smiled and I nodded. And people just assume that if someone is smiling and nodding, that they're agreeing with you. And I actually felt that my most valuable interviews were the people I disagreed with, because I really wanted to get them on record as to where they came from. And in a lot of cases, they were able to justify their positions. I still didn't agree with them,
sure,
but I could understand their way of thinking in the process. And so we interviewed just about every layer in the Senate. Dick Baker and I did the interviews initially. Dick interviewed one of the policemen, the Capitol policemen, and gave us a terrific interview. You know, I looked for, I did the three first chief clerks, chiefs of staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee during basically the coming of the Vietnam War, and how William Fulbright fell out with Lyndon Johnson over the war. And we sort of moved from section to section, doing different people, and I interviewed the parliamentarians of the Senate, which was terrific because they explained to me the peculiar rules and the peculiar precedents of the Senate and how those operated. And then the parliamentarians never talked to the press.
Right.
Well, reporters used to call us all the time, and sometimes they would call us about parliamentary questions. So I would call the parliamentarian would explain it to me, and then I would call the reporter back and explain it to them in the press. So that way the parliamentarian never had to talk to the
It's like the mafia.
But you wanted to make sure that our rule of thumb with the press always was, we want to make sure they get the story right. We're not taking sides. We're not giving either party's position. We're just trying to get the basic factual information correct, and that became a big part of what we were doing. And that's also how I wound up writing books about the history of the Washington Press Corps, because so many reporters called us with so many questions, and I got curious about how they reported. I read the stories the next day. How accurate were their stories? And then I wondered, well, how accurate are the things that I've used in the past? And so I wound up going back and starting with the 19th century, and then also wrote a book on the 20th century press about how they develop sources and how they maintain those sources and how accurate the information is that they're.
Who had the best questions?
Oh, there were quite
That's a hard
few.
question, I know, but
I'm thinking that some of the people that I enjoyed working with the most were Paul Kane from the Washington Post, and Carl Holst from the New York Times, and Cheryl Stolberg from the Times. They would spend a lot of time with you. There was a brand new reporter, a young reporter for the Washington Post, who called him, and he had a take on what he was doing. And I said, that's not exactly the way I would see it. And I explained to him the history of the situation. Well, about a week later, his story came out, and it was on the front page above the fold. So I contacted him. I said, thanks for getting, I was quoted up there. I said, thanks for getting me on the front page. He said, no, thank you for getting me on the front page. He said, it was all that historical information that caught my editor's eye. And that's why I got off the back pages and up to the front page along the way. But there were lots of reporters. I enjoyed working with Helen Thomas enormously. I got to be good friends with Roger Mudd, who was a CBS correspondent, who knew more about the Senate than anybody knew about
Georgia
the Senate.
man.
Yes, and just a wonderful person with a wonderful sense of humor. A lot of them would come by, and sometimes they would inform us as the calls would start coming in sort of breathlessly. And I'd have to say, wait, what happened that you're asking this question? And they would tell me what had just happened in the Senate, which I hadn't heard about yet. And then we would try to, our whole office would sort of work together to come up with a fact sheet on what that was, so we could basically give the same information to everybody. In those days, we might get 20 or 30 calls in a single day about a single issue. And 3 or 4 of us would be answering the question. So we'd have to be working off a fact sheet. Nowadays, everybody goes to the internet, and so you post something there, and you tell people it's there, and they can find it, and the phone doesn't ring anywhere near as often as it did. But I got to personally talk to a lot of reporters. And in 2001, I started keeping a list of who called. And in October of 2001, my building shut down because of an anthrax attack. By that point, I had 360 different press agencies or reporters had called.
Wow.
So I don't know what it would have been like if I had done it through to December. But I printed that list in the front of Reporting from Washington. I was getting ready to submit that manuscript at the time. And that's why I was keeping that list. It was a lot of foreign correspondents who you have to explain to them what the Congress is. It's not a parliament. And that helped. I eventually wrote a little book on the Congress, a short introduction. And one section in there is why not a parliament? And so explaining to most of democracies of the world are parliaments.
Right.
And so if you're a reporter from any of those countries, you've really got to tell your readers or your listeners how different this institution is here.
It's like explaining the Electoral College every
Yes.
4 years.
Yeah, we used to give lectures, and one of my lectures was on the Electoral College, and I used to say that Alexander Hamilton drew the short straw. He had to defend the Electoral College in the Federalist Papers, and he said, if it's not perfect, it's at least excellent. Which I thought was an interesting way of explaining what they went through. I should, given the fact that we're talking about congressional papers too, I should say very early on, a big part of my job at the Senate was dealing with congressional papers.
Right.
Part of that was because there was absolutely no guidelines for opening
Right.
records. And so we were getting requests from the chairman of committees saying that they'd heard from some researcher who wanted to look at these records. Would we screen them for them? So every week I was down at the National Archives going through records. I looked at a juvenile delinquency subcommittee, which was full of Mad magazines and other comic books.
Right.
Then we had somebody who it was the papers of Daniel Webster were interested in the period when Webster was chairman of the Finance Committee. So I went down and looked through those records, and I wrote a very tongue-in-cheek memo to the chairman of the Russell Long of the committee, saying that I was able to discern that no personal privacy or national security would be violated by opening these records from the 1850s.
I think we're good.
And then Carl Bernstein wrote to Ted Kennedy when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee to get access to his father's papers, records. His father was investigated during the Red Scare and lost his job. Actually, he was a union organizer in the federal government. He lost his job because of his politics. And so I went down and read through this fascinating stuff, and I wrote back to Senator Kennedy and said that that was sensitive material, but by all means he should have access to it because it's about his family. And Senator Kennedy incorporated that into his letter to Bernstein. Bernstein incorporated it into the introduction to his book, Loyalties, saying, of course I should have looked at these records. You know, he was almost indignant that I had brought it up along the way. But
you're trying to help him out.
That instance also helped me when I was working on my book on the press code, because I had to work about Watergate and about Deep Throat.
Right.
And everybody was trying to interpret who is Deep Throat. And I thought a lot of it was very specious, and I didn't want to name somebody and then have it turn out not to be that person. But it struck me that I was astonished that the FBI had been trailing Carl Bernstein since he was a boy. At his bar mitzvah, they actually were writing down the license plate numbers of anybody parked at the synagogue where he was being bar mitzvahed. And somehow no one in the FBI ever told Richard Nixon that half of Bernstein and Woodward and Bernstein came from a red past. And Nixon was a red baiter from the start. I thought what he would have done with this. So it was clear that the FBI was holding things back from Nixon, and I began to look at the FBI as a source. And I came to the conclusion in the end that Deep Throat had to be in the FBI, and that every time the investigation seemed to be hitting a solid wall, Deep Throat would leak something, and that would allow the Post to continue the story. So it kept the story alive It didn't defeat Richard Nixon in 1972, but the story was still alive by 1973 when other newspapers started getting onto it. So all these things wound up being tied together. But also, in addition to the Senate records, we had the senators' records.
Right.
And in 1976, a lot of the veteran senators voluntarily retired. Now, somebody like Mike Mansfield had been giving his papers to Montana for years. There was no problem there. But somebody like Stuart Symington had been a senator now since 1952 and had a huge collection and had to give his papers to a university. So University of Missouri offered to take his papers. And I went down to sit in on the meeting between Senator Symington and the archivist from Missouri. And Senator Symington had been the Secretary of the Air Force. And every time the Air Force came out with a new plane, they sent him a model. He had beautiful model planes. There had to be 1,000 of them.
You should see the Russell Library.
Well, yes, I'm sure, right. There are lots of these all around. The military knows how to curry favor. But the archivist from Missouri said, well, we're not interested in taking any of the planes. And Senator Symington said, unless you take the planes, you're not getting the papers. And so I was in the middle here, and I worked out a deal with it that the university took 100 planes that they could put in a display case, and then Senator Symington's family could take the other planes, and that the papers would go. And part of it was just talking lingo to the two sides in the process. That worked out. The next year, I wound up with next person senator I dealt with, I think it was in '78, was William Scott, the first Republican from Virginia since Reconstruction. He was the senator who's most famous for holding a press conference to deny a magazine report that he was the dumbest U.S. senator, thereby proving the magazine had sort of put their finger on it. He was a very nice man, but he's tended to speak before he thought. And we worked out a deal. He was giving his papers to George Mason University, which was a newly developing campus. This was going to be their first manuscript collection. And so it was a very nice meeting of the two, and I'd helped to negotiate that. And then the day before the ceremony, a reporter from Spencer Ritchie, I think his name was, from the Evening Star, interviewed Senator Scott and said, "Why are you giving your papers to George Mason?" And Scott said, "To clean up the clutter in my office." And so the headline in the Star the next day was, "Scott dumps clutter on George Mason University." You know, and so that you learned that there were all sorts of problems with helping to find this. But the big turning point was 1980. Because of the Jimmy Carter not only lost, but that he conceded at 8 o'clock at night on election night before the polls were closed on the West Coast. A lot of very senior senators lost election by very close. Frank Church, Warren Magnuson, George McGovern. 13 U.S. senators lost their seats. And not only that, but the Democrats lost the majority for the first time since 1955. It came as a shock to the Democrats. It came as a shock to the Republicans. Nobody had anticipated something of this magnitude. And so suddenly, all those offices had to be emptied out within a month after the election. And so Dick Baker and I divided up the list, and we went around and knocked on doors in the Russell Building and other buildings. And I can remember at one office, I said, "I'm the historian," and they said, "Oh, it's the historian." It was like, "Oh, it's the Undertaker."
Oh yeah.
This year. And so we had to really rush to find places to send those papers. And I remember going to George McGovern's office, and his secretary said, "He's leaving on a cruise tomorrow, so you have to see him today." So I went into McGovern's office, and that poor man looked so depressed. He looked like he'd been hit by a 2x4. And he was not particularly interested in talking about his papers. And even though he had a PhD in history,
that's right,
he said, I never went to a college in South Dakota. I did graduate school at Northwestern. My advisor was Arthur Link. And he said, "He's not even there anymore." I said, "I know. Arthur Link is at Princeton University." And I said, we looked up, and you had given your presidential campaign records to Princeton, and we recommend that you keep records in one place. So it would make sense to give your papers to Princeton University. And he was, and I said, besides, it would only be fair, because they have the records of John Foster Dulles, and someone needs to balance that. And he looked up and he started to laugh, and he said, wouldn't that be rich? He said, my ranting and raving about Vietnam on the same shelves with John Foster Dulles' pious pronouncements on foreign policy. I'm giving him my papers to Princeton. And so he did, and the next time I went to Princeton, the Sealy Mudd Library, there was a portrait of George McGovern in there because they have his papers. People in South Dakota haven't really forgiven me because they thought that those records should have gone there, but there was nobody stepping forward to take them at the time.
Right.
But it was so hit and miss that Dick Baker and I realized that things had to be regularized. The first thing Dick did was to go to Senator Byrd, who was stepping down as majority leader, and get him to pass a resolution in the Senate to automatically open all Senate records after 20 years. Unless they dealt with personal privacy, national security, or investigations, they could be closed for 50 years. But that's it. Everything opens automatically. The House set up a 30-year rule eventually. Ray Smock got that so that researchers don't have to go and petition to look at Daniel Webster's records.
Head in hand.
Right. It's open once you get to the archives for the most part.
Right.
So that happened. And then the second thing was in 1982, the Senate Historical Office hired an archivist, and that was Karen Paul, who we had known, who we were working with, because she was working with the records of the Congress at the National Archives, and that changed things. We professionalized the whole issue. I no longer went to the National Archives on a weekly basis, and she began to compile this massive inventory of where are the papers of U.S. senators, tracking them down, that side of the operation in the Senate has really grown terrifically, because now they also have staff who are helping senators when they leave office to get their records ready, so that they're not just dumping massive collections onto libraries. I remember the University of Washington, first they'd gotten Warren Magnuson's papers because he was defeated, and then 2 years later, Scoop Jackson died.
Right.
And the archivist there said it was like Mount St. Helens going off and dumping this onto those two massive collections coming in at the same time. So we began to systematize things so that now Karen gives lectures to the new incoming senators at the very beginning of their careers, encouraging them to keep their records in such a way that they can transfer them to an archives at the end of their terms, and explaining the importance of all of that. Also to their chiefs of staff.
Makes my job and my director Cheryl Vought's job a lot easier when the time comes.
Yes, well, Cheryl Vaught told us that when Senator Richard Russell died, it took a couple of tractor trailers to take away his records.
Multiple tons. They didn't do linear feet back then. It was tons. Of crates, and but you're right. The size, the volume of these collections, and if you're not prepared for it, I think there was a story from University of Vermont when George Aiken's papers were dropped off. It took them something like a decade to process because you're just not built for that.
Right.
If you're not prepared.
These are big collections, and yet they're full of really rich materials. And we always tell people it's not just the senator, it's not just the Congress, it's every issue that the federal government deals with. George Aiken dealt with agriculture. If you want to really know about agriculture in the mid-20th century, his papers are a terrific place to go. There's the same thing with Richard Russell. Agriculture is a huge issue in part of his career. Military is a big part of his career. Appropriations is a big part of his career. You learn about how government actually operates by looking through the records of these long-term senators. So it was always in our interest to make sure that those records were preserved, and that in records that had been in barns and in attics and other places were finally transferred to a proper archives to warn the archives what was coming in the process. And so we built up good relations with archives around the country, and especially archives that had started up focusing on Congress, like the Everett Dirksen Library in Pekin, Illinois, or the Carl Albert Library in Norman, Oklahoma. And so we developed good connections. You mentioned University of Vermont. I went up to the University of Vermont for a special symposium when the papers of Aiken were open, and they invited scholars to talk about the wise old owl of the Senate, the Senate during the era of George Aiken. And Lola Aiken, his widow, sat right in the center of the first row. And when you spoke, if she agreed with you, she would say yes, and if she disagreed, she would go like that. So every speaker kept an eye on Lola and how she was coming out. And at one point I said, George Aiken had 4 offices in the Russell Building. She went like that, and I said, but he never moved. They kept changing the room number as the building was reconfigured, and then she smiled.
You got her back. So how did Karen's coming on board, how did that shift your job or responsibilities or free up your job?
Right. People would say, what do you do every day? And I'd say, I never know until I get there in the morning. Because sometimes the phone would ring and something would happen that would throw you, whatever you planned off.
Sure.
Sometimes the call came from a senator. Sometimes the call came from a leader. And we always said all senators are equal. Some senators are more equal than others. And
Animal Farm.
If either of the leaders called, and especially the majority leader, that we all dropped whatever we were planning to get to prepare for that. I was, on a regular basis, I was doing oral history interviews and processing them. I was also editing documents. I was editing the closed hearings of the Foreign Relations Committee, their executive hearings. And then later I started editing the Joe McCarthy materials. We were writing histories. We did a history of the Senate Republican Policy Committee. We compiled the minutes of the Democratic and Republican conferences up through 1964 for publication. So I always had editing materials on my desk, and I would always say about a third of my work was editing, a third of my work was oral history, and a third of it was research and reference types of questions. Once Karen came on board, I was able to put the archival things to the side. Essentially, we still consulted, and we all worked on the helped her with the big guide to the senator's papers and tracking things down. And we still worked with senators and still divided things up sometimes but essentially Karen took the lead on all things archival at that stage.
So was Karen sort of the liaison to the Congressional Papers Roundtable, or is that something that you did as well?
Karen was the primary liaison, but Dick and I both participated. I went to Society of American Archivists meetings, and I spoke at some of them, especially about oral history and archives, and about the Senate and archives, but that was not my regular thing. My regular organization was the Oral History Association, which very early on I wound up becoming program chairman and vice president and president, and so it really, in the 1980s, was largely given over to that. Dick was working with the Society for History in the Federal Government and the National Public History Conference. Those were his primary organizations. I was on a lot of committees for those.
Right.
We had decided, and I give Dick credit for this, he decided early on that we, as public historians, we needed to be historians. That the best public historians are the best historians. And we needed to continue to attend conferences, to give papers, to draw attention to what the office was doing, but to have a regular history career, publications and other things. And so we all had outside activities in different groups, but Karen took the lead on most things archival. There was the other issue on that was the National Archives initially really didn't like the records of Congress because they were not accessioned. The Congress owns those records. They're just stored at the Library of Congress. And once in a while, some member of Congress say, we're taking our records out, that sort of thing. Well, that's just an idle threat. But as a result, they bounced around. When I first went to the National Archives, congressional records were teamed up, I think, with environmental records, and then with Indian policy records, and then with foreign policy records. And no particular rhyme or reason. It was just they merged the staffs of those. And the records, of course, stayed in the exact same position. And that's again how we got to meet Karen when going down, because she was working. George Peros was the senior archivist for congressional records. He had a couple of younger archivists working with him. And then when Dick got very active in the movement to make the National Archives independent.
Right, from the GSA.
Exactly, from the GSA, which Herbert Hoover in his wisdom had thought, well, they both dealt with paper, so we put them together. And it was not a marriage made in heaven, and
no.
It did not work. And finally they persuaded enough members of Congress to get behind making it independent. And Bob Warner was so thankful that he agreed to create a Center for Legislative Archives at the National Archives. But even at that point, they didn't really treat records of Congress with the kind of respect that Congress thought they should. And so the initial archivist, the head of the center, was a GS-14. Now that meant that they brought in some outstanding people and then immediately shifted them around to other places at the National Archives. They would come in, they would go on rotation, and they would never come back. And we went through a couple of changes like this. And Dick finally went to Senator Byrd and said, this is a problem. And the way to solve this is through the Appropriations Committee. The next appropriation for the National Archives, the head of the Center for Legislative Archives should be a GS-16, which is a top-level position. It's equivalent to somebody who's the head of a presidential library.
Oh, wow.
And so therefore, the records of Congress are on the same par with the presidential libraries. Senator Byrd said yes. And the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, he got it in there. National Archives was not happy about that, but there's nothing they could do about it. And Mike Gillette came in and he set about trying to make the Center for Legislative Archives a presidential library for our Congress, essentially, because he had worked at the LBJ library.
Right.
And he knew what he was doing. And he did elevate the status of that division and gave it a lot more clout inside the National Archives. And today, a lot of the records of Congress are now going to be stored in the old government printing office building, because the Center for Legislative Archives was able to persuade the National Archives that they'd outgrown their space at the National Archives, but they had to keep their records in the District of Columbia. Congress mandated that, and so they've taken
Interesting.
care of that.
So they couldn't ship it to Narratu? Or
No, I think originally the archives thought they were going to send them out to College Park, and then they were reminded there was a law that said that those records had to remain in Washington, D.C. And that's, again, one reason that they really don't like dealing with Congress, because Congress can really throw its weight around. But of course, it's to the advantage of the National Archives to have Congress on its side, because Congress is also appropriating its funds and determining other legislation. I should add in here, by the way, the first week I was on my job in March of 1976, Dick and I went down to the National Archives because the Commission on Presidential Papers was meeting. They were writing the Presidential Records Act, which has been in the news. Much in the news these days along the way. Little did we ever think that a president could be indicted under the Presidential Records Act. But the reason for that was that Richard Nixon had always threatened he was going to destroy the tapes.
Right.
And they decided that the records had to be the property of the government, not the property of the individual presidents. And so I went down. I remember that Herbert Burnell was the chairman of the commission. I got to meet him. J. Lee Rankin was on that board as well. A lot of prominent people, William Luchtenberg and Frank Fidel. Here I was. I went from being an unemployed historian one week to mingling with William Luchtenberg and Frank Fidel the next. And of course, I appreciate the fact that it wasn't because of me. It was because of the job that I had just been appointed to, and that they were just delightful people and became good friends over the years. But that Presidential Records Act then came out of that commission that was meeting. The National Archives in those days had an archivist named Mary Walton Livingston, a very, very proper lady. The archivist of the United States was Bert Rhodes. He was tall and thin, had dark hair and a mustache. I was tall and thin and had dark hair and a mustache. One day I was standing in the lobby of the archives, and Mary Walton Livingston came by, saw me, put her head up, and stormed past me, and then stopped and turned around and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said. "I thought you were Dr. Rhodes." And she had been the person who'd caught Richard Nixon backdating his gift of his papers, and that so he could take a tax write-off on it. And that had been one of the early Watergate scandals that it really involved the National Archives. And Bert Rhodes had not been happy with Mary Walton Livingston, and she had never forgiven him for not supporting her at the time. But suddenly I was sort of thrown into all of this activity, and just as an historian, I loved watching how government worked and how it didn't work in some cases, and the part that we were playing in it.
Well, in 1983, 1984, we've mentioned Ray Smock a couple times in this interview. What was it like from your perspective in your perch over in the Senate that the House was finally getting around to trying to maybe play catch up and create their own historical office? How much help did you lend in that effort?
It was a real godsend when that happened. I mean, I described the situation of when the Senate was operating without a comparable office in the House, as trying to ride a bicycle with one wheel missing.
Oh, wow.
And we would get calls about the Senate, about the House. We really weren't in a position to be able to answer them. We would help if we could, but the House and the Senate are two remarkably different institutions. I compare them to a liberal arts school and an engineering school on the same campus. They have buildings right next to each other, but they don't have anything to do with each other. And you have to think differently if you're going to be working in the House. And so we were delighted when they created the House Historical Office. And I was especially glad when Ray Smock was hired, because I'd known Ray from graduate school since 1967 when I first arrived. He was he and Pete Daniels were two of the senior graduate students who sort of took us junior people under their wing and got us acclimated to graduate school. So it was a terrific situation when they opened that up, and we worked in tandem back and forth until 1994, when the Republicans won the majority in the House for the first time in 40 years. Now, unlike the Senate situation in 1980, when you had Howard Baker coming in,
right.
Howard Baker was an institutionalist.
Right.
And right away he let everybody know that only the top people were going to change. He understood that everybody else worked for the Senate as an institution, and he was going to make no changes at all. That's when we knew that Howard Baker was a true statesman. Newt Gingrich should have known better. He thought what happened in the House was the French Revolution, and he guillotined everybody. Anybody who was there obviously worked for the old regime. They got rid of the chaplain. They got rid of the parliamentarian. These are people who work for the institution, not for the party.
They're civil servants.
Well, there's no civil servants.
You're right. There's not even civil servants.
It's the equivalent of. These are people who dedicated themselves to the institution, who worked for the majority and worked for the minority. And Newt let Ray Smock, not only did he let him go, but he said they were closing the office. They were going to abolish the historical office. Now, Newt Gingrich had a PhD in history.
Yes.
Newt Gingrich had been on the search committee to hire Ray Smock. He knew Ray was a nonpartisan person. He knew that it was a nonpartisan position, and yet he closed it down. Well, I was invited to Arizona State University, has a short class in January in public history, and so I was out there, and on Monday I discovered that Newt had appointed another historian. Even though he had shut down the historical office, he had appointed another historian.
Christina Jeffrey.
Yes, someone he had taught a course with in Georgia, and clearly looked on this as a patronage job. And so I called back to find out what was going on, So I'm out there all week on, I think it was on Friday of that week. He fired Christina Jeffries. For one, because they just had not vetted her for the position. And there were some things in her past that were rather shocking to the members along the way. She had reviewed a proposal for the NEH and said that it didn't adequately present the Nazi point of view. So I'm sure that's not exactly what she meant, but it was not the best way to present it. And basically she made herself so controversial that Newt had to fire her. And she then sued him for breach of promise and ran against him in his next primary. So I'm sure he was very regretful that he had let Rees-Mogg go, but certainly regretful that he had hired her. And as a result, that as long as he was the speaker, there was no House Historical Office. And then Dennis Hastert came back as the new, and he had been close to Robert Remini in Illinois, and brought Remini in as House historian. And Remini sort of started to create an historical office. Remini was a very fine historian, and he was in his 80s at the time, and came back as a public historian, and he loved doing it. He loved the whole part of it. But he was sort of an amateur public historian. He was a professional historian. They needed a rock-ribbed, solid historical office, not just glad-handing, but actually doing the things that an office needs, the historical office needed to do. Very much the types of things that we were doing, so that there was a balance between the Senate and the House. And Matthew Wisniewski became the House historian.
From University of Maryland,
yes,
I believe.
Another person who was a student of Keith Olson's at Maryland. We used to call us the Maryland Mafia. I tell you, the federal government is filled with federal historians who trained at the University of Maryland. In those days, the idea was if you were next to Washington, D.C., take advantage of Washington, D.C.
Fred Israel was onto something.
Yes, and Walter Rundell. And, in fact, I was a graduate student. The official historian of the Labor Department came to Maryland to teach for a year, and the professor of labor history at Maryland went to run the labor history office. And it was a huge benefit for the students at the time to be exposed to what was going on in federal history, and also there were a lot of CEDA grants that came out as a result of connections to the Labor Department. Things got much better once there was a House Historical Office, and much more regularized. And in addition, after 9/11, the Congress finally decided to fund the building of a Capitol Visitor Center. It had been in the books for about a decade, and we'd gone to meetings and helped to promote it, but Congress kept saying, we're not going to spend this money on ourselves. At one point they thought they would raise money privately to build this, as if people are going to give money to the federal government to build a building for Congress. It did not fly at all. But once, there was the shooting of 2 policemen right inside the Capitol building, and then 9/11, and that's when they realized that they needed more security. After the shooting of the 2 policemen, they realized that the screening would take place a block away from the Capitol, not inside the door of the Capitol. And after 9/11, they realized that there might be a need for alternate meeting space for the Capitol. So this vast underground complex was created, and they decided there was going to be a museum as part of that. And so our offices worked together intensely on a museum which lasted 10 years and has now been completely redone. The current offices have done those as well. But we've had part of the mission of the Senate Historical Office and the House Historical Office is public outreach. And we do public outreach to academics through conventions, but we do public outreach to the public through the Capitol Visitor Center, through the website, through publications, through pamphlets, through anything that we can provide, and even to answering questions when people have been watching C-SPAN and they're confused about what they saw, and they call us and they ask us, what does this mean? And we went out of our way to answer questions to the public whenever they got through to us. And so the office is there, and whatever Congress thinks of next, it's probably going to need an historical component because it's an historical institution. It's been over 200 years it's been in operation. its rules have remained remarkably similar over that period. Its peculiarities have remained remarkably similar, and it lives on precedents. It needs to know what it did before and why it did that. And historians are able to provide that information, and again, with no spin on it. That
right.
We gave the Republicans and the Democrats exactly the same information. One favorite story on this, 1989, George H.W. Bush nominated John Tower to be Secretary of Defense.
That's right.
And it immediately became a controversial nomination. And it looked like he was going to be defeated. Senator from Georgia, Sam Nunn, was a key player in that as chairman of the Armed Services Committee. And Senator Dole, who was Republican leader, and Senator George Mitchell, who was the, was it 89? Yes.
Yeah.
Still 80. George Mitchell was the new Democratic leader, asked for the same thing. We got a request, how many former senators have been defeated if they've been nominated for the Senate or Supreme Court? So we found this list, and we created a list of 6 names of people who were senators who had been nominated to either the Cabinet or the Supreme Court and had been defeated by the Senate. Gave exactly the same piece of paper to the Democratic leader and the Republican leader. Senator Dole stands up and says, "Mr. President," holding our document, "this is practically unprecedented. Only 6 times in over 200 years has a former senator been turned down for a position of this magnitude." Senator Mitchell stands up holding the same document and says, "Mr. President, there is historical precedent. 6 times in the past the senators turned this down." Well, the 7th time came when Senator Tower was defeated at that stage.
Right.
But both of them, they had the facts right. They interpreted those facts in ways that fit their needs, and that nobody exaggerated, nobody said anything that was wrong, nobody said something that the newspapers could fact check along the way. There were some consequences to this, by the way. President Bush still needed a Secretary of Defense, so he reached down into the House of Representatives and took their whip, Dick Cheney, to be his Secretary of Defense. The House needed a whip.
Yeah.
They moved up Newt Gingrich. If it hadn't been for Tower, it would have been Speaker Cheney in the House of Representatives, not Speaker Gingrich. And so that might have been.
And Ray might still be at
yes, exactly.
the U.S. House of Representatives.
A very different situation along the way. So you never know. There are all sorts of unintended consequences.
Right,
in
right.
American politics.
I like to tell the story about how back in 1992 was my first election that I was cognizant of, and my mother came home from campus. She'd gone back to school, and she was wearing an Al Hofeld button. I'm from Illinois. She was not happy with how our incumbent Senator Alan Dixon had voted during the Clarence Thomas hearings. Well, the election comes around, Carol Moseley Braun wins the primary. Carol Moseley Braun wins in November. She's defeated 6 years later by Peter Fitzgerald. Peter Fitzgerald then retires, and a young state senator named Barack Obama runs for Senate, wins that election over Alan Keyes of all people. And you know, the history is very serendipitous. Right. You know, so you know, we have Clarence Thomas perhaps, right, or Alan Dixon to thank for
Al the Pal, right?
Yes, that's right. One of Southern Illinois' last great statesmen from Belleville. And Paul Simon from McCandus, right?
Things happen, and it's one reason as an historian I never predict what's going to happen in the future.
No.
Because I know that so much unpredictable activity is happening. I used to tell my students when I was teaching, they'd say, "What do you think is going to happen with the presidential election next year?" And I'd say, the event that's going to determine that election probably hasn't happened yet. And there have been a lot of situations like that. Yes, and I remember George W. Bush taking Barack Obama aside when Obama was elected to the Senate and saying that he noticed that they had both run against Alan Keyes. And George W. said, he was a piece of work, wasn't he? that was a peculiar situation. And I was doing a book at that point called Our Constitution for Oxford Press, for high school students. And it was richly illustrated. And on the election, on direct election of senators, they asked me if I would recommend pictures for it. And I said, there's an election going on in Illinois that is amazing, and you need to do that. And so we have a picture of Barack Obama campaigning for the Senate in that book at that stage. And who knew that, 4 years later, he was going to be president?
Right.
I didn't see much of Obama when he was a senator. One day, both of us arrived in the parking garage at the same time, and he went through the door ahead of me. But as a senator, he didn't have to go through the magnetometer. He just walked around it, and I had to go through the magnetometer. And I watched him walking down the corridor straight ahead of me. He had long, lanky legs, and he took long stride, and every head turned as he went by. He just attracted attention. Everybody knew that this was a guy who's on his way somehow in the process.
Were there other senators in your time in the Senate who you had that sort of magnetism, I suppose?
Yeah. It's interesting that you sit in the Senate gallery, and most of the public doesn't recognize most of the Senate. And even their own senators, they have trouble recognizing sometimes. And then all of a sudden the door would open and Ted Kennedy would come in, and there'd be a buzz through the gallery. Hillary Clinton would enter, buzz through the gallery. John McCain would enter, there'd be a buzz through the gallery. There were people who stood out right away in the process and were fascinating to be around. There were others who I just liked as people, that they weren't going to go beyond along the way, but were just really decent and interesting, funny students of history. They often would, after a Senate recess, senators would come back and they'd tell me that they'd been in a lot of planes over that period.
Sure.
They did a lot of reading, and they just finished this book or that book. Had I read this? What did I think of that? They were very well up on history, and they all have hideaway offices.
Right.
Some of them magnificent, and some of them little closets in the basement. And I got to visit maybe about a third of those hideaway offices over the years. The one thing they all had in common was every one of them had a copy of Master of the Senate on the bookshelf. So they'd all read that carefully.
Lots of residuals for Mr. Caro.
Right, and Robert Caro spent a year in the Senate. We got him an ID card. Dick Baker got him the ID card. And he hung out in our office, and he wandered around. He wanted to get the feel for the institution.
Now, is it true that Dick had them the Senate gallery like return to the 50s, 60s feel?
Before C-SPAN, the lights in the Senate chamber were twilight. Yeah. In fact, the first time I sat there in 1968 and looked down, Everett Dirksen was asleep at his desk, never raised his head, and you could do that, in those days. Once C-SPAN came, it went from twilight to high noon, and it changed things. So Dick arranged for the engineers. It was in the summer. Or it wasn't the summer, it was a recess or something.
Sure.
At some point when the Senate wasn't in session, to dim the lights to the way they would have been in the 50s when Johnson was there. And I think it was Bill Bradley came in, who was Johnson's height, 6'4", I think, and stood by Johnson's desk to give a sense of how he would have loomed over the chamber. And Caro got the feel for it, and Caro always wanted to say, what did it look like? How does it? What did you see? Because he writes very visually, and he wanted to recreate that.
Sure.
In the books. The other one who did that was David McCulloch, and he wanted to recreate Truman's run from the Board of Education to the Senate when he got the call to come to the White House in 1945. And Dick arranged for him on one condition, that he be able to run with him. And so they got a Capitol policeman to run with them as well. So after the Capitol had closed, right after 5 o'clock, McCulloch, who's a distinguished-looking man with gray hair and a pinstripe suit,
sure.
Dick also in a suit, and a Capitol policeman, ran from the House of Representatives down to the Senate. This is 2 or 3 football fields length to run. And as they were going through the rotunda, one of the other policemen said, "What happened?" And the policeman who was running with them said, You don't want to know.
You wouldn't believe it if I told you.
But McCulloch describes that in his book, Truman, very vividly, too.
We're talking about Robert Caro and David McCulloch and how they're trying to get a very accurate feel and write very precisely. Now, when I was growing up, there were movies like National Treasure and Dan Brown's book. Does that make your job harder, or is all press good press for us in a historian?
Well, no, there are things you have to. There are lots of things that get repeated often that are just wrong.
Sure.
I can guarantee you that the next inauguration, some member of the media is going to say, well, Ronald Reagan was from California, so he moved the inaugurations to the west side of the Capitol. Well, the Capitol, up until Reagan's inauguration, the inaugurations had always been on the east side. Now they're going to on the west side. Jimmy Carter was the last president inaugurated on the east side. The Joint Committee on the Inauguration gets underway months before there's an election. It was in the fall of 1979 that they started building the new stage on the west side. They just decided it would accommodate more people, and it would not disrupt the parking as much as the other did. If Jimmy Carter had been re-elected, he would have been inaugurated on the west side. Then they would have said, we flip-flopped, But Ronald Reagan, what he did was he bought it. He owned that issue because he wrote it, or his speechwriters wrote it into his inaugural address, that he was looking out over Arlington, where the great soldiers were, and then on to the West Coast and all the rest of it. But it was not his decision to make. But the reporters will always say, try to attribute that. It seems obvious to them, so they do that. And it's those seemingly obvious things that we have to try to correct from time to time. In terms of the movies, Senator Byrd once gave a speech on the Senate in Literature and Film, and we drafted the speech for him. And he wouldn't give the speech until he had seen the movies that we had listed. And he did not go to the movies. So he had never seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He had never seen Advise and Consent. And the other movie we had was The Senator Was Indiscreet, which is a very funny little William Powell comedy from the 40s. And and I guess maybe Tennessee Johnson, about Andrew Johnson's impeachment. But Byrd, we got him the VHSs in those days. He took him home on the weekend, and he watched the movies. He came in on Monday with a list of all the parliamentary mistakes that had been made. And the vice president never calls for a vote. This doesn't. But he gave that speech, but at the end of the speech he said, but what the heck, they were just movies. But actually, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, well, the big problem with that is everybody thinks that's a filibuster. Right. And that somebody should be talking. And most filibusters, nobody's talking at all these days. They're just voting against cloture. The Advise and Consent was a very accurate account. It was based on Alan Drury's diaries from the 1940s. And then he grafted onto it events in the 1950s, particularly the suicide of Lester Hunt during the McCarthy era. I always wanted to meet Alan Drury. In fact, I read his Advise and Consent when I was 14. It was the first political book I read. And I just really wanted to meet the man. And I had a mutual friend who was always going to set up an appointment. But Alan Drury was a very shy man, and he avoided personal meetings. But we corresponded. We sent letters back and forth. He wrote to me one time that he regretted that he hadn't kept his diary longer so he could have cannibalized it for more books. And he admitted that Advise and Consent was a cannibalizing version of it. But he captures the spirit of how the Congress works. The one thing that I did different when I wrote my book about the press gallery and about the reporting from Washington is I said that Drury used the press as a Greek chorus. He never identifies them. They're just known by their publication. So Time magazine says this, and the Washington Post rebuts it, and this is back and forth. It's a very nice device that runs through the book. They're never named. But I was doing the opposite. I was trying to figure out who were the people who were behind these media outlets and representing their media outlets in Washington.
Tell me about the transition from associate historian to historian. Which was this a torch passing, or was that something you never aspired to? But
you know, I tell people for 33 years I had the absolute perfect job in Washington. I was the associate historian, which meant I dealt with pure history. I never had any administrative responsibilities. I wasn't involved with hiring people. I wasn't involved in the budget. Dick Baker was superb in handling that. He was just, and I had complete confidence in him, and I think he had full confidence in me. And so he could delegate things to me to do while he was busy going to meetings and taking this and this, and I could run things on the Senate side back and forth. I would have been happy if he had outlasted me and had retired after I retired.
Oh, no.
I would have been very happy to do my job right on through. But then he retired in 2009, and I took over his position. And the asset to that was I dealt a lot more closely with the senators. And that's because Dick had started the practice of going to the Democratic luncheon every Wednesday and starting with a historical minute. And so many senators stood up to say something about when he retired, about how much they enjoyed those historical minutes, that Senator McConnell came to me and said, I didn't realize you were doing that there. We'd been asked by Senator Daschle to do it over there. He said, could you do something like that for the Republican side? And I said, yes, we would, but they meet at the exact same time. So I said, my colleague, Betty Coed, and it's K-O-E-D, Coed, would come to the Republican luncheons, and I would go to the Democratic luncheons. And that helped because we sort of tailored these little talks to fit what the party was interested in and things like that. And so we're dealing a lot more closely with the senators. They got to figure out who I was. For years, they confused me and Dick. We used to say it was Don Baker and Dick Ritchie, and they would sort of look at me puzzled, like, didn't you have a mustache before, a beard? That was Dick. You're dealing with. And I've been called out at public events by people who were really talking about Dick, but confused with me.
And you just smile and nod.
And we were a great team together, and so now I'm in charge, and I worried a bit because now I was going to have to do things like hiring people. And my first hire was Kate Scott, who became the new assistant. She's the associate, and she'll be the Senate historian someday. And she turned out to be a terrific asset to the office. The other hires all seemed to work out okay. I regretted having to go to so many meetings. There was a pandemic actually in 2009. I've forgotten which one it was now.
Swine flu, I think.
Guess, but I went to a 3-hour meeting that boiled down to, if you feel sick, stay home. And so I realized I was going to spend a lot more time in meetings. And I would sit in my office doing what I was doing, and I would listen through the wall, and I could hear Kate doing an oral history. And I think, I'd much rather be over there doing that in the process. So I was happy to have the position. I was sad to have to hire young people to do the things I really like to do. And then I continued on till 2015. And Ann and I both retired from she was with the National Gallery of Art, and I was with the Senate. And so we both retired. We took the last 2 weeks of federal employment. We took as vacations. We went to Italy to a wedding. A woman who worked with Ann at the National Gallery of Art, and a man that I knew who worked for a senator at getting married. So we went to a wonderful Italian wedding. And the day we flew back to the country, we were officially retired from the government.
Well, that's the way to do it. Yeah. I'm telling you. Do you think we'll ever reach a point where the papers of Congress, the papers of senators, are going to be on par with presidential papers and presidential libraries? Well,
maybe not individually, but collectively, I think. Historians still break things down into presidential administrations, as if Millard Fillmore is more important than Henry Clay and Daniel Webster in a lot of ways. And it's just sort of built into the system, unfortunately. Textbooks are organized by presidential eras, that sort of thing. I think, though, that the historians, and especially I'm hoping for a revival of history, interest in political history, especially because we went to a generation of race, class, and gender, and it's some point going to dawn on the people who are doing race, class, and gender that all of those have changed the Congress, and we've had a woman Speaker of the House. Practically every important position in the Senate today is filled by a woman. 25 of the women senators are women. It's a growing number constantly. More African Americans, more Hispanics, Native Americans being elected to Congress. I think at some point people are going to realize that they need to go back and start doing political history again, that politics is important, and that national policy affects everybody. And when they do, they're going to discover that there are huge resources that have been collected, oral histories, papers, centers for study of Congress. These are gifts that they're going to realize that are sitting there. There's endless number of doctoral dissertations sitting in congressional archives. And I think that will help a little bit. The fact that presidents aren't venerated quite the way they were in the past will probably help. And Watergate helped in some respects, that people looked back and saw Congress doing a noble thing and investigating Watergate. And I think other people are really going to rethink more modern history as well. Congress isn't just an obstruction to whatever presidents are trying to do. So I think that there'll always be a disadvantage. For one, the president is a single person. The media finds that it's easier to focus on the president than it is on 535 others who don't speak with the same voice and are disagreeing with each other and all the rest of it. Congress is harder to explain. I've done a book called The U.S. Congress, A Very Short Introduction, and I had 35,000 words to explain the Congress. And the first thing I had to start off with by saying is there is no such institution as Congress. There is a Senate and a House. They operate in the same building. Nothing becomes law until they both do the same thing. But they're just not the same. You have to understand the House separately from understanding the Senate. And I tried to do this in a package that would help to explain what was going on. The good thing about that was that I couldn't go beyond 35,000 words, so I couldn't get lost in the weeds. And it's very easy when you're writing about Congress to get lost in the weeds.
Right.
But the other thing is that when I was doing my James Landis book, the first library I went to other than the Library of Congress in Columbia was the FDR Library. And that was a big boost to me to find those records, not only to get those records, but there were really helpful archivists out there who would say, if you're interested in looking at that, you should also look at this. Or they'd bring some records down. They'd say, this will tie in with what you're doing. And they would define and explain things to me. The FDR Library still is one of my absolute favorites anywhere. But I think in the future, young people working on doctoral dissertations are going to wind up at a congressional collection, at a Richard Russell Library, or the Robert C. Byrd Library, or the Carl Albert Library, the Everett Dirksen Library. And some very helpful archivist is going to come out and say, if you're interested in this, here are the collections you should look at. You should, this back and forth. And after you finish here, this is where you ought to think about going to look at. And here's the websites that you can check out and find materials that are already there. So I think when historians become interested again in political history, and I'm convinced that will happen at some point, that they're going to find that the doors are open for them in a lot of places, and the records are there and waiting for them to use.
Well, it seems like there has been a spike in interest in Congress and politics since the Trump administration, and trying to understand the norms, the new norms, and also, there's been some effort of more independence from the on the part of the Congress, especially with the January 6th. And as somebody who spent 40 years, almost 40 years, in the Congress, what were your feelings on January 6th when you were? I assume, like me and my wife, you were at home watching TV or looking at your computer screen.
Yes, ironically, I was at home with my 8-year-old grandson watching a cartoon when we got a text message from our friends in England, saying, "Is the Senate secure?" And I thought, what is he talking about? So we switched from the cartoon to CNN, and there it was, this astonishing scenes of the hallways that I'd walked down for years, filled with people in wild costumes meandering around and trying to disrupt the Congress and the proceedings of Congress. It was just astonishing. There's nothing that compares to it. And even 9/11, when probably the Congress was one of the targets of the plane that didn't make it to Washington, there was something more remote about that.
Sure.
But this was right there, and it was a violation of everything. It was a violation of the Constitution. It was a violation of all of American history, essentially, all of the norms of politics and society. And because I was really concerned about the people I knew, and I found out very quickly that because of the pandemic, everyone in the Senate Historical Office was teleworking. They were not there. But there were others who were there. And I mentioned the parliamentarians. We worked very closely with the parliamentarians. And I have known the current parliamentarian since she was a librarian in the Senate Library years ago, before she went to law school. And so I became very worried about them, and I found out that the entire Senate had left the Senate chamber and had gone to a secure location. I later on talked to the Senate barber, who opened his door to see the entire Senate, going through the corridors, the basement, moving from the Capitol building to one of the office buildings. The Elizabeth McDonough, who's the parliamentarian, and her staff had the wisdom to gather up the electoral ballots and to take them with them. Her office is in a very obscure part of the Capitol. A lot of staff couldn't find that office because it's just not on the beaten track. But the people who came into the Capitol that day not only found her office, but trashed her office. So I think those were the people who were leading the pack in the process. And from what I understand, they just ripped things apart, presumably looking for the electoral ballots. Someone told me that the Senate parliamentarians are not allowed to take their cell phones into the chamber because there's no electronic equipment in the chamber. And their cell phones are on their desks, and the people who looted the office swiped their cell phones, which of course enabled the FBI to track them down by the GPS systems. The fact that these people were wandering around taking selfies of themselves, a lot of the people who came into the building were the followers who didn't have a clue what they were doing. Most of them had never been in the Capitol before, and were taking pictures of themselves with the statues. They did some destruction. They destroyed a display on the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. They destroyed a poster, I think, of John Lewis. So there were things that got them riled up. On the Senate side, we didn't have anything as horrific as on the House side, where they tried to break through the door and there was a shooting in the process. But to disrupt a constitutional effort, and there was, when back in the 2012 and 13, for Obama's second, I sat in a committee as Senate historian that was with the parliamentarians of the Senate and the House, lawyers from the Senate and the House, the historians and the archivists from the Senate and the House. And we went through every electoral ballot to make sure everything was valid. There was one state that got the wrong date for the inauguration because it was not being held on Sunday, it was being held on Monday. There was one state voted for Willard Romney and one state voted for Mitt Romney. There was somebody who actually voted for Barack Obama. And so the concern was to make sure that all of these ballots, which came in very different ways, so some of them were so ornate you could hang them on the wall, and some of them looked like they just came out of a dot matrix printer. But to make them consistent so that when the vice president opened them and called them out, there would be no grounds for objecting to this or that. But this was clearly a plan to try to force the vice president to violate essentially his constitutional role. And I'd say the vice president did exactly what he should have done. in this case, and did not go beyond his constitutional role. My general complaint about the Trump administration was that I don't think the President of the United States had ever read the Constitution of the United States, because every time he quoted it, he got it wrong. The worst was his comment that I have a Second Amendment, Article 2, that allows me to do anything I want as president. And I spoke to a group of school teachers one time. I said, if any of your students wrote that on an exam, you would probably give it an F, right? They all said yes, yes. I mean, that's what we're up against. But to try to disrupt the counting of the ballots was just an unforgivable act. And you know, C-SPAN has a poll that they take every 4 years of the presidents. They have historians and political scientists ranking the presidents, and it's a very fair poll because it's not a popularity poll. You have to rank them in categories of civil rights, of dealings with Congress, of public persuasion, of foreign policy. And so civil rights, for instance, has always worked against the first 7 or so presidents because they owned slaves. So George Washington went down a notch or two in this poll. They did a poll in December of 2020, and Trump came in 4th from the bottom. He was at the bottom was James Buchanan.
Mm-hmm.
Then above him was Andrew Johnson,
Mm-hmm.
and then above him was Franklin Pierce, and then Trump. Now I was one of the people polled, and I actually put Pierce above Trump along the way.
I would have said Harding would have been pretty.
Well, Harding used to be at the bottom, but he's been, because his paper's opened, he's been re-examined, and he gets.
He's a three-dimensional character now.
Right. And opening of papers has always helped presidents' public images and the scholarship that comes out about them. Well, I mentioned to Susan Swain, who's chief executive officer of C-SPAN, that people were going to be very unhappy with this poll because Trump's supporters were going to be very unhappy that he ranked so low, and Trump's opponents were going to be very unhappy that he wasn't lower. I think if they had taken the poll after January 6th, he would have clinched the last place. And I have a feeling that future polls are going to put Trump in the last place of a president who really betrayed his office and his responsibilities. And so it was a very unforgivable action, and a shocking one. As I say, I walked through every one of those corridors, and to see that kind of behavior and the disrespect, and you know, it was not something that could have been predicted, I think, and certainly not something that can be forgiven.
Thinking back, you know, your job for so long was oral history, and you have to imagine that the Senate Historical Office eventually will undertake oral histories of January 6th.
Oh, they've been doing it since right after.
Okay, that was my question.
The Senate and House historians have been doing interviews. So is the Capitol Historical Society. The only group that weren't cooperating with doing the oral histories were the police, because they were going to have to testify in so many trials.
Yeah.
Hopefully after the trials are over, the police will participate as well. But they have amassed a considerable record of first-person accounts of what happened that day. And I'm sure people are going to be writing about this, you know, in future decades and centuries, and those records will be a major asset.
Well, thinking about, you know, again, your almost 40 years on Capitol Hill, you know, what were some of the highlights that if you know, we've been reflecting now for almost 2 hours, but if you had to identify some of those signature moments in your career?
There were, well, everything was exciting to be there when things were going on. And my first inauguration, you know, the first one I stood outside in the cold and froze. And the second one, I was in the old Supreme Court chamber. I was running the old Supreme Court chamber for the current Supreme Court, so that someone would watch their coats, and when they went out to the stand, and I got to chat with most of the justices, including Harry Blackman, who had told me what a frightening professor James Landis had been. He was always, Blackman was always slinking down in his chair, and so Landis wouldn't call on him. And then I looked over and I saw Thurgood Marshall standing by himself underneath the statue of John Marshall. And I thought, I hate to interrupt anybody, and he was just looking ponderous, and because Reagan was being inaugurated that day, he was clearly not in a good frame of mind, and he was going to try to have to outlive Ronald Reagan, and I walked over and I said, "Mr. Justice Marshall," I said, "you're standing under a bust of the first Justice Marshall, and this was the court that he presided in." And he looked down at me and he said, "I'm not interested in history, and I don't want to talk about it." And I said, "All right." I stepped away, and the clerk of the court came over and said, "Well, that's Thurgood." He said, "One day he'll bite your head off, and the next day he'll throw his arms around you in a bear hug." So he was not in a good mood that day. So getting to meet people like that, I met Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia and all those other people at different times when they came to functions at the Capitol. I wound up. I was in the gallery for a number of events that I considered historical events, and it was really dramatic to be there for it. And the one that stands out in my mind was that the Senate and House were going to pass a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The House had passed it already with 2/3 vote. The Senate had 2/3 senators committed to voting for it. So they were going to add an amendment to the Constitution. And then Mark Hatfield, who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, actually sat down and reread the amendment, which he had sponsored and endorsed. And he read it again and thought, this will be a disaster. It's going to tie the government in knots when it's going to need flexibility to do things. And so he told Senator Dole that he was going to vote against it. Senator Dole was getting ready to run for president in 1996, and this was going to be one of his big accomplishments. Dole was obviously disappointed, terribly disappointed. Senator Hatfield offered to resign from the Senate so they wouldn't need his vote. There'd be 99 and to get through. Dole wouldn't hold him to that. And that day, every seat in the gallery was taken. Every senator was on the floor. The staff were all over the place. I was up in the staff gallery, and I could see Senator Dole's face when Senator Hatfield came through the door, and he knew what was coming, and that Hatfield voted no. And Hatfield really destroyed his career at that point. There's no chance that he would keep his chairmanship of this committee to that Congress. And the Republicans rewrote their rules for their conference that the chairman had to be elected by the conference, therefore had to follow the party line. That was the most noble act I ever saw of anybody sacrificing themselves for what they thought was the public good. I was there for the Clinton impeachment trial. It wasn't quite as dramatic because we knew how it was going to end, but we were very much involved in that trial, and it felt significant that we were writing things that both sides were going to be using and searching for information. At one point, for instance, we got the request, so did the Senate Library, so did the Library of Congress, and it was basically, has anyone other than a member of the House of Representatives ever argued an impeachment case on the Senate floor? The chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Henry Hyde, was convinced that they had, because he remembered they'd had some impeachments of federal judges a decade earlier. We found out that we went through the complete record. There had never been anybody other than a representative who made a case on the floor. The House Judiciary Committee counsel had made the case in a committee meeting, not on the floor. And the Senate had heard testimony in committee rather than as a body when they were voting on the judges. And so the House had to change its strategy. They had planned to have their counsel make their case for them, and instead they had to apportion the case out to their members. So information that we were gathering was actually having an impact on what was going on in the chamber and in the Congress. So there were instances like that when you really felt plugged into the events. So it was a memorable career, and not every day was memorable, but every day was a pleasure. I don't think I ever had a day that I regretted going into the U.S. Senate. I always was sort of curious as to what was going to happen that day. And I just thoroughly enjoyed it. I tell people I had a front row seat to the best show in town.
Well, you're retired now. So what do you get up to now that you're not documenting Congress and going into the Beltway every day?
Well, I retired from the federal government, but I didn't retire from the history profession. And so I
don't know any historians who ever have.
Yeah, my old graduate advisor used to say historians never really retire, they just have more time to research. And so I have done a lot more researching and writing, and I worked on a book about Drew Pearson, a biography of Drew Pearson. I did a book about Bess Abel, who was the social secretary in the White House, was a friend of mine, and we enjoyed socializing with her when she died. Another friend, Terry Birdwhistle, and I edited her oral histories in a little book called Washington's Iron Butterfly, about her experiences in running the social side of the Johnson White House during the Vietnam War. And I've just published a new edition of my little book, Doing Oral History, which is post-January 6th. It tries to explain January 6th and the Trump years in a very short version, which has come out as an audiobook now. I'm very pleased about. And I'm now working on a new edition of Doing Oral History, which has come out about every 10 years. And so things have changed a lot in the technology and everything else about oral history. So it's time for a new edition.
It makes our lives easier. It makes our lives harder.
Right.
Especially the managing of expectations these days. That's I find to be the biggest challenge. It's not necessarily technological or technical aspects, but managing the expectations of those who think, oh, you've got 4K and 8K, and it's like, well, that's a whole lot of space, and you have to store it somewhere. So yeah, it's been a challenge, but thank you for everything that you've done to document Congress, and thank you for everything you've done for the oral history profession. I know this program at the Russell Library wouldn't be where it is without folks like you and Doug Boyd and others who were trailblazers in the field.
Well, you know, we each had a foot in the public history camp and in the oral history camp, and the two sides go together really intimately. And so I've been very pleased that I was able to play a part in that. And I think if I had to redesign my career, I'd do it exactly the same way.
Well, a life well lived, if you can say that. Don, thank you so much for taking time this morning and this afternoon, I suppose. We're into the afternoon
Thank
now.
you for coming and doing this.
So thank you from everybody on behalf of the Russell Library. Thank you.
Good.